My name is Margaret, and I'm 34 years old. I live in Geneva, Switzerland, a quiet city famous for its precision, banks, and pristine streets. In 1972, life here follows a nearly flawless order. The country's neutrality reflects the attitude of its people, always discreet, always polite. The city is a mosaic of calm, surrounded by snow-capped mountains and the deep blue of Lake Geneva that glistens on sunny days. A tranquility that, until now, extended to my personal life as well. My routine as a psychoanalyst had never been particularly eventful. The cases I've handled over the years were nothing more than broken people trying to find meaning in a world that often seemed indifferent. But everything changed when I received Antoine, a 42-year-old man, thin with sunken eyes and disheveled hair. He was different from my other patients, and it quickly became clear that he carried something far darker than simple trauma. Antoine first came to my office on a rainy Tuesday. I remember the strange sensation of discomfort when I shook his hand. It was cold, colder than it should have been. His file showed a long history of psychiatric hospitalizations, a mix of diagnoses: dissociative identity disorder, possibly paranoid schizophrenia. But nothing seemed to fit precisely. He began our sessions with prolonged silences, his eyes fixed on some undefined point behind me, as if he were watching something I couldn't see. His words came out hesitantly, loaded with anguish, and as he began to open up, I felt a deep connection to his suffering. Antoine was a man who had been shattered by a past he could barely recall. His father, a strict diplomat, had died when Antoine was still young, and he seemed haunted by the absence of that figure. Sometimes he spoke of his father as if he were there, present in the room with us. Over time, my pity for Antoine grew, and that was my first mistake. Pity has no place in our profession. It clouds judgment, confuses boundaries. But I couldn't help it. He seemed like a man slowly sinking into an abyss, and I was desperate to save him. But things started to change. Antoine's silences became longer. Sometimes I felt as if his eyes weren't just looking at me, but stripping me bare. In one session, he abruptly interrupted his account and asked, "Margaret, do you believe in ghosts?" It unsettled me, but I kept calm and tried to steer the conversation back. It was just a delusion, I reminded myself. Antoine kept insisting, mentioning that he felt the presence of something or someone in the room, something that wasn't his father, but something much worse. He claimed it had followed him for years, but in recent weeks, it had become impossible to ignore. I tried to rationalize it, of course. It was part of his disorder, some hallucinatory extension that I had yet to fully identify. However, things started spiraling out of control outside the office. He began following me. I would see him on the streets, near the markets, close to Parc des Bastions, where I usually walked in the evenings. His eyes fixed on me, but he never approached. He just watched. During our sessions, he began to speak about me in a disconcerting way. Not as Margaret, his therapist, but as if I were part of his own mind, an entity somehow inextricably connected to him. I knew this wasn't normal, knew he was crossing ethical boundaries of the profession, but something stopped me from ending the treatment. It was as if Antoine had ensnared me in something I couldn't fully comprehend, yet was fascinated by and terrified at the same time. Then, one night in October, everything changed. I was alone in my office, going over my notes, when I felt a presence. It wasn't Antoine, or maybe it was, but he wasn't there physically. The lights started flickering, and I heard a whisper. A whisper I couldn't fully make out, but it seemed to come from all directions. I turned around several times, but there was nothing. The silence that followed was suffocating. I knew something was there, and the worst part was that I knew it was connected to Antoine. In the next session, Antoine smiled for the first time in months. but it wasn't a comforting smile. He seemed to know what had happened to Denis, as if he were controlling it. "He's close to you now, Margaret. I see him." I froze. I tried to maintain my professional composure, but something was profoundly wrong. I felt it in every fiber of my being. In the days that followed, the whispers continued. In the office, at home, during my walks in parked as bastions, the presence grew stronger, but I couldn't identify where it was coming from. The people around me didn't notice anything, but I was becoming increasingly paranoid. Finally, one evening, I decided to confront Antoine about what was happening. But when I arrived at the office for our last session, he wasn't there. There was only a note on his chair. "I told you he was with you. Now you'll see." I never saw Antoine again. He disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he went. The authorities found nothing. But the whispers never stopped. They still follow me.
My name is Michael Turner, and I'm a clinical psychologist in Westbridge, a quiet town nestled on the English coast. It's one of those picturesque places with cobblestone streets, centuries-old pubs, and small independent shops that line High Street. The town is well known for its historical architecture and the nearby Westbridge Abbey, a medieval monastery turned tourist attraction. On a typical day, the sound of seagulls and the scent of fresh fish from the local market blend into the air, evoking a sense of peace. But lately, my peace has been shattered. My office is located on a quiet street near the Westbridge Gardens, a well-manicured park where I used to take walks after work. The gardens are beautiful, with ancient oak trees and carefully arranged flower beds. It was my sanctuary, until my sessions with a patient named Simon Garrison began to unravel everything. Simon first came to me about 6 months ago. He was in his mid-40s, with thinning hair, a thick build, and eyes that always seemed to be darting around, never fully focused on anything. His wife had referred him to me, suspecting depression. She mentioned that he'd withdrawn from everyone, spending hours staring at the mirrors in their home. Initially thought this might be a symptom of a deeper psychological disorder, perhaps a manifestation of psychosis or a severe dissociative condition. But the more I spoke with Simon, the less straightforward his condition seemed. At first, he was silent during our sessions, barely responding to my questions, his eyes always fixed on the large mirror that hung on the wall across from where he sat. When he finally did speak, his words were unnerving. "They're always watching from the other side," he said. "In the mirrors, they're waiting." Tried to engage him further, hoping to uncover more about these people he saw. I thought this might be some kind of delusion tied to paranoia. But Simon was tight-lipped, refusing to elaborate. He would only sit, his eyes fixed on his own reflection, as if it held some kind of secret I couldn't understand. As the weeks went on, Simon's behavior became more erratic. He began coming into the office earlier and leaving later, as if he were avoiding something outside. When he did speak, it was always in vague riddles about the other side and the things he couldn't change. His obsession with mirrors grew, and so did my unease around him. Then there were the dreams. I began having vivid, unsettling dreams where I was wandering through Westbridge Gardens, but the landscape was distorted. The trees loomed larger than life, their branches twisting unnaturally. The Abbey's tower, normally a comforting landmark, appeared skewed and crooked in my dreams. And everywhere, there were mirrors, in the windows of the shops, on the faces of statues, even in the water of the small river that ran through town. In the reflection of these mirrors, I saw people, but they weren't familiar. They were distorted versions of people I thought I knew. There was a man who looked like Simon, only his face was slightly wrong. It wasn't Simon. It was something else pretending to be him. I would wake up in a cold sweat, shaken and disoriented, unsure of what was real. At my office, I began to sense subtle changes in my environment. It wasn't just Simon who stared at the mirrors anymore. I found myself doing the same. I'd catch glimpses of movements that didn't make sense, shadows that flickered just out of view. Sometimes, I would glance at my reflection and notice the tiniest delay, as if it wasn't quite in sync with my movements. I grew paranoid. I removed the mirrors from my office, thinking it might help, but Simon noticed immediately. During our next session, he looked at the empty spot where the mirror used to hang and smiled. A strange, knowing smile that chilled me to my core. "They never go away," Simon said, leaning forward in his chair. "You can take down the mirrors, but they'll always find a way back." That night, I had another dream. I was walking along Westbridge Pier, but instead of the usual tranquil view of the sea, I saw an endless expanse of dark water, filled with floating shards of glass. Each shard reflected a different version of me, some slightly older, some younger, some almost unrecognizable. They watched me, with expressions ranging from apathy to malice. I woke up gasping for breath. From that point on, I began avoiding my own reflection. In the mornings, I would shower in the dark and dress without glancing at the mirror in my bedroom. Even in the windows of my house, I made sure to look past the glass, never directly into it. My wife noticed my behavior, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what was going on. How could I explain it? I was a trained professional, a man who had spent years helping others confront their fears and delusions. Yet here I was, terrified of something as ordinary as a mirror. The final straw came one evening after a particularly tense session with Simon. He had been speaking in riddles again, talking about how they were ready for me. As I left my office and walked home, I felt a strange compulsion to visit the Abbey. It was late, well past visiting hours, but something drew me there. I walked through the ancient stone corridors, my footsteps echoing off the walls. At the end of the corridor, near the old crypt, there was a large ornate mirror I had never noticed before. It was ancient, with an intricately carved wooden frame that looked centuries old. The surface of the mirror was dark, almost black, like a pool of still water at night. I felt a strange pull toward it. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the blackness. And then, something moved. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the darkness, twisting and contorting, until they formed a face. It was my face, but not quite. The eyes were different, colder, sharper. The mouth twisted into a cruel smile. I took a step back, my heart racing. But the reflection didn't move. It stayed there, smiling at me with a malevolence that I could feel in my bones. "You can't escape it," the reflection whispered. "No matter where you go." I ran out of the Abbey that night, but something inside me had changed. No longer recognized myself. Every time I caught my reflection in a window or a puddle, I saw that twisted version of me, staring back. I don't go to work anymore. I've boarded up the mirrors in my house, but it doesn't matter. Every time I close my eyes, I see him, the other me, waiting in the darkness, ready to take my place. Maybe he already has.
remember the day I started therapy like it was yesterday. It was pouring rain over the streets of Salem, Oregon. The city seemed suffocated under the weight of the water, with its tall trees and empty parks reflecting an eerie silence. I was restless, too anxious to live another week without understanding what was eating me from the inside. The grocery store I always went to felt like another planet. The noise of the aisles echoed in my head, and I could barely breathe in there. The clinic was in an unassuming building near Bush's Pasture Park, a place I used to visit when I needed peace. It seemed ironic now, looking for peace in a place that brought me so many questions. I entered the building and walked into Dr. Charles' office. He was welcoming, with his penetrating gaze and soft voice, always attentive, as if he could see inside my soul. The first sessions were normal. I was lost in my own thoughts, and he seemed to help organize them. But something changed. Dr. Charles had a way of making me feel important, special, as if I were the only person who mattered in his world. Whenever he looked at me, I felt something stir inside me, a sensation I couldn't name. A part of me longed for his words, another feared what he might see. I tried to ignore it, but that feeling of discomfort took root. The sessions became more intense. He guided me through memories I had buried. "Don't be afraid to open those doors, Beth," he would say, his soft voice echoing in the stillness of the room. And I obeyed. I told him things I had never told anyone. He had a way of making me talk, and with each session, I felt more dependent on his questions, more anxious for his answers. He was kind at first, always smiling and reassuring, but something shifted. Slowly, I began to realize that his questions were becoming more invasive, more probing, as if he knew exactly where to touch to make me bleed inside. There was something in his eyes, a kind of gleam I couldn't decipher. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overanalyzing everything. But as I left his sessions, I felt empty, as if he had taken a part of me that I would never get back. Once he asked me to close my eyes and visualize a safe place. I thought of Bush's Pasture Park with its open fields and old trees. But when I visualized it, the place seemed different. The trees were taller, darker, and the silence, instead of comforting, was heavy. I tried to explain this to him, but he just smiled and told me to keep going. "You're on the right path," he said, but I didn't feel like I was on the right path. I felt lost further and further away from myself. As time passed, something else started happening. I felt like he was present in my life outside of the clinic. Not physically, but in a way that was impossible to explain. Sometimes, while walking the streets of Salem, I would catch myself remembering something he had said, and shortly after, something strange would happen. I would find myself in situations where his voice whispered in my mind, guiding me to act in certain ways. And I obeyed without question. It wasn't that I believed he was manipulating my mind. But on the other hand, something was deeply wrong. I withdrew from my friends, stopped going to the places I used to love. Even going to the store became a burden. It felt like at every corner, I could sense his presence, like a shadow. It wasn't a typical fear, but something deeper, something gnawing at my sanity. I started dreaming about him. In my dreams, we were at the clinic, but it wasn't a normal session. I was sitting in front of him and he wasn't saying anything, just staring at me with those eyes that seemed to devour my essence. I would wake up gasping for air, feeling a weight on my chest, as if I were being suffocated. One day during a session, he asked, "Beth, do you trust me?" That question echoed in my mind for days. Did I trust him? He knew so much about me, had delved so deep into my psyche that I didn't know where he ended and I began. It was as if he had entwined himself with my thoughts, with my very existence. But then he started suggesting things, small comments, almost imperceptible, that I only realized after hours of reflection. You should distance yourself from people who distract you. Your job is consuming you. Maybe isolation will help you find clarity. And without realizing it, I started pulling away from everyone, as he had suggested. I found myself alone, relying solely on the sessions with him, craving each encounter, even though it left me more disturbed. In the last session, something happened. I was more nervous than usual, and he seemed different. He wasn't the welcoming Dr. Charles anymore. His presence was almost oppressive, as if he were imposing himself on me, even without moving from his chair. "You need to accept that the truth is inside you, Beth," he said, with that soft voice that now sent chills down my spine. "Only I can guide you there." I started crying, not because I was sad, but because I was afraid. I was afraid of where he was taking me, afraid of what I might find if I kept digging so deep. But more than anything, I was afraid that without him, I would lose myself completely. That night, as I walked home, the rain fell again. I couldn't get his words out of my head. Was he right? Did I need him? Or was I just sinking into something I never should have started? I still don't know the answer, but one thing is certain: since I met Dr. Charles, I've never been the same. And I'm afraid that if I continue, I might never be who I once was.